Good evening, everybody. Find your seats. Thank you. My name is David Steiner. It is a great pleasure to welcome you here to this historic Roosevelt House. Many of you are veterans of these occasions when I had the privilege of being dean at the School of Education at Hunter College. Some of you are new guests in this new enterprise, the Hopkins Hunter Forum for Education Policy. Let me reiterate that in leaving Hunter, I never wanted to leave it entirely. Partly, I must confess, because of this beautiful space. And it is thanks to two people, one of whom is here, my new dean, David Andrews, and Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College, who together enabled us to have the use of this space for public programming and to continue a great tradition of bringing voices from many different parts of the spectrum to address issues of importance in education policy. The thanks go to Dean Andrews, to President Rabb, but also to my old friend, Faye Rosenfeld, standing at the back, who not only is chief of every operation in Roosevelt House, but makes this event possible and all our events. Thank you, Faye. There are many partners who have made tonight's event possible. First, let me thank the Center for Talented Youth at Johns Hopkins University, whose executive director, Elaine Hansen, is with us tonight. You have done so much, Elaine, to advance access to excellence for our country's students. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for being with us tonight. The Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, represented by our former chancellor, Executive Director Harold Levy, has been steadfast in their support of gifted and talented education. They've sponsored the important report, Equal Talents, Unequal Opportunities, which is the subject of tonight's discussion, and provided generous support for this gathering. We would also like to recognize the Overdeck Foundation, represented by Brian Carter. Brian, thank you, for its support of research underway at the Center for Talented Youth and at Hopkins, and for its commitment to supporting excellence for all of America's students. The Thomas B. Fordham Institute is responsible for this conversation happening here tonight with all of us gathered. Thank you, Cheka, as always, and from afar, Mike Petrelli, for inviting us to participate in this discussion. We have other guests here tonight. First, my old friend, Phil Weinberg, the Vice Chancellor for Schools here at the great and largest school district in the country. He has the very modest responsibility of ensuring that 1.1 million school children are well educated. Thank you for joining us, Phil. I also want to recognize Tony Fisher, the principal of the Hunter College High School. Where are you, Tony? There you are. And Dean Ketchum, director of the Hunter College Campus Schools. Welcome to you both. It is a great pleasure for me to continue this series of discussions. As veterans will know, I tend to want to get on with it and not go on around biographies because you can read them. So let me now invite our first speaker, Jennifer Giancola from the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, who is going to lay the scene by discussing the findings of the report. Jennifer.
Thank you. Good evening, I'm Jennifer Giancola. I'm the Director of Research at the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation. And I'm here tonight to share with you some of the findings from our report, Equal Talents, Unequal Opportunities, which I had the pleasure of co-authoring with Dr. Jonathan Plucker, who is a professor in gifted education at the University of Connecticut. So this report is about the excellence gap, which is the disparity in attainment at the advanced level of education. So you hear a lot about achievement gaps at the proficiency level. Well, there are gaps also between low-income students and other students at the advanced level, in the sense that low-income students are less likely to reach advanced levels of academic performance when compared to other students. So this is a report we wrote to highlight that at the state level. And we looked at information examining how states are supporting advanced education for high-achieving low-income students. minute about the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation. We're dedicated to advancing the education of exceptionally promising students who have financial need. We look to close the excellence gap through grants, which we give to educational partners in K-12 and in college, and through our scholarships, which we support students in high school, college, and graduate school. To date, we've given out over $80 million in grants and $132 million in scholarships. We also do research, and that's where I spend my time. And that's what this report is about. This report was essentially a report card where we graded the states, all 50 states in the District of Columbia, in two key areas. Their policies. What policies do they have in place that support advanced learning for all students, especially low-income students? And their student outcomes. What % of their students are reaching advanced levels of academic performance? And the reason that we wanted to do this is because we think for too long in this country, we've been focusing a lot on proficiency. Proficiency is extremely important. Of course, children need to read, and of course, they need to be at their grade level and learning what they're supposed to be learning. But we think in this focus on proficiency for too long, we've been ignoring unwittingly our highest achieving and our smartest students. So we wanted to gather information together that we could use to engage states in a dialogue around how they might make small changes to ensure that their smartest students, their most advanced students, were being challenged. So I'll talk first on the policy side. We actually did literally grade the states, and we set out we identified 9 policies, and we thought if you have these 9 policies in place, you have a starting framework for supporting advanced learning for all students. And unfortunately, what we found was no state got an A. No state had all of these policies in place. We had 3 states that we gave an F to because they had none of these policies in place. But for the most part, everyone's in the middle. We had a lot of C's and D's, and we had 6 states where we gave them a B-. That was our highest. So what kinds of policies are we talking about? Things that we think are pretty simple. Things like, does the state require schools in the state to identify advanced learners? 36 states in this country do, but 15 do not. Likewise, if you're going to identify advanced learners, you probably want to serve them in some capacity. But it turns out 20 states do not require services, which means there are 5 states out there that require identification but no services, which we found rather intriguing. We looked also at acceleration, things like, can you enter kindergarten ready? If you have a very bright, precocious child whose birthday is 2 days after that cutoff, can that child, if they're academically and socially ready, enter kindergarten early? In 20 states, the answer is no, it is illegal. And we also looked at accountability. All of our states now have accountability systems. They are tracking data, they're capturing, they're analyzing it, they're using it to make decisions. And so we asked the question, do those accountability systems have any measures of advanced performance? Even one. Things like how many students are taking AP courses in high school. 11 states do not. So the result of this is that we looked at these 9. We found no states that had all 9 of these policies in place, or even 8, or even 7. The most was 6, and the average was 3. And this was one of the first findings that really surprised us. We expected to see some states doing a lot, and some states doing nothing. And instead what we found is that in most states, there's a little bit going on, but it's haphazard. So you have states that require identification but not services. You have states that allow children to enter kindergarten early but not then to skip ahead a grade, or to allow 8th graders to take high school courses for credit. Or you have states that don't require and don't have any gifted programming, but they're tracking it in their monitoring system, or the reverse. So it was very haphazard, and we think this results not from any intentional factor, but from just not paying attention to it. That no one is really concentrated and said, where are the places where state policy could make a difference for advanced learning? So that's the policy side. I'll share briefly with you the outcome grades now. Of course, policies are important, but what really matters is student learning. So here we're looking at 2 broad measures, both what % of students overall in your state are reaching advanced levels of performance. And in elementary and middle school, we were using the 4th and 8th grade NAEP assessments. In high school, we were looking at AP exam results. And then we wanted to look at the excellence gap. So taking those NAEP results in 4th and 8th grade, what percent of low-income students in the state scored advanced on the NAEP? So the NAEP, as you know, you can be at basic level proficiency, or you can score advanced. So we're looking at what percent of students have reached the advanced level, disaggregating by income, so low-income students compared to everyone else. And again, we were disappointed that we couldn't give any state an A. We didn't have any Fs this time, but we did have mostly Cs and Ds, and we had 6 Bs, which were not the same 6 states that got a B in policy, with the exception of Minnesota. So we called up Minnesota. We said, what's going on in Minnesota? And they identified 2 factors. Number one, they said that there was a woman in the administration there in the state government who this was her passion, this was her flag. She had been there for a long time, championing for advanced education, and that was one of the reasons that their policies were so strong. And then they also cited, they said, we have a very strong research community at the universities in this state who are looking at this issue and trying to understand advanced learning in Minnesota for Minnesotan kids. And we feel that that has made a difference in our state for outcomes. So I'll dive a little more deeply into one of the outcomes. Now I'm going to walk you through this. We're talking about here, we're looking at 4th grade reading. NAEP examination scores. For every state, the states are along the bottom, left to right, you have 2 bars, a gold bar and a red bar. The red bar shows the percent of low-income students who scored at the advanced level on the NAEP in 2013. And the gold bar is the percent of all other students who reached the advanced level. So you notice a few things. Number one, that red bar, the percent of low-income students who are scoring advanced, doesn't get above 5% in any state in this nation. It hovers around 3, and in some states it's 1 or 2%. The second thing you notice is that there's a pretty big gap between the red bar and the gold bar for each state. That's the excellence gap. That's what we're trying to close at the Cook Foundation. And the third thing you notice is that that gap, when it's smaller, or when it's larger rather, it's not because low-income students are doing better. It's because the other students have jumped ahead, right? So the District of Columbia is actually the furthest over there on the right. They have the largest excellence gap in the nation. 26% of non-low-income students in the District of Columbia score advanced on NAEP in 4th grade reading. 26%, 1 in 4 4th graders who are not low-income in the District of Columbia reach the advanced level, compared to 2% of low-income students, 1 in 50. So what do we want to do about this? Well, first, we looked at this and we said, we've got to grade this. How do we grade this? So what we determined was, ideally, we'd want to give an A to states where the percentage of low-income students reaching advanced is the same as other students. That wasn't going to happen. So we said, all right, we'll be easy graders. If your low-income students are doing half as well as your other students, you get an A. So if the ratio is 50%, if your low-income students is 50%, the percent of low-income students reaching advanced, you'll get an A. But what we found was we couldn't give any A's even with that low bar. That the highest, we saw the highest ratio is in the 40s, and that in most states, the percent of low-income students reaching advanced is only 20 to 30% that of the rate for other students. So what do we do about this? We draw 3 recommendations out of this work. The first is we think it is essential that you identify high-achieving students and advanced students. If you don't know who your bright minds are, how can you possibly serve them? And in doing that, and where we are having a lot of really rich conversations with states right now, is we think it's important to know who are the low-income students who are being identified, and what percent of your low-income students are being identified for advanced services. And if that percentage is low or lower than their representation in your state, which it will likely be in all states, what are you doing about that? And there is a lot of work, wonderful work out there on identification and different ways to do that. The second recommendation that we have is what we call create pathways to advanced learning. We are not prescribing any one methodology. We think that there are many different ways to challenge advanced learners, both in and out of the school, and it depends in part on your school and your environment and the resources that you have. There is tremendous research out there that acceleration, allowing a student to move at their own pace, works and is one of the best things you can do for an advanced learner. And that doesn't have to mean skipping a grade. It can mean just going ahead in a subject, taking an advanced math course in the next grade because you can and you're ready for it. Advanced coursework like AP courses, IB programs, we see a lot of this in high schools. Distance learning is something that can be really powerful, especially when we're talking about rural states and rural schools where they might be very small. There might only be one advanced learner in a whole grade of 20 students, right, in 7th grade. Connecting that student to the resources that we have on the internet can be very powerful. And summer programs at the Cook Foundation, we do a lot of support around summer programs for our high-achieving low-income students, and we see that can really, really just jumpstart their learning and shoot them into another level. So identification, creating pathways, and monitoring performance. Accountability. How are your students doing? What % of students are reaching the advanced level? And when we're designing our state accountability systems, let's not just settle for proficiency. Let's ask the questions of how many of our students are engaging in advanced learning and how many are taking AP courses, for example. And again, when you're monitoring your performance, disaggregating it by income, low income versus not low income is critical. And the monitoring, we think, comes up a lot. We know education is a local control issue, and in many states, state governments are loath to prescribe and to tell schools what to do. But we think that they can, at a minimum, set some standards for what they expect their students to learn and have some of those standards be more than just a floor of proficiency. So I'll leave us there. That's a frame for the conversation. If you would like to download the full report, it is available on our website, www.jkcf.org, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to start by asking our two panelists to comment on the report, which they've read, and to bring out any issues that they see with the report, questions, concerns. Please, Amy.
First I'd like to just thank Jennifer and the Jack and Cook Foundation for this tremendous report. I think in many ways it wasn't surprising, but it was certainly a nice wake-up call, a way for us to sort of rally around some of the issues. And I think one of the really critical issues that is raised here is really not as simple as we might want it to be, and that's this issue of identification. If we're going to say to schools that you should identify, and I absolutely believe these schools need to identify, we're faced with a lot of great difficulties, starting with this issue of how do you identify in the low-income students, particularly the under-resourced schools. So there are many approaches to identification that are out there, but I think what we're learning is that many of them don't work or they're not scalable. So when we talk about how we're going to make recommendations to schools, I think one of the things that we need to start partnering more on this piece of identification. So we have lots of data from places like the Center for Talented Youth, where we see that our rates of being able to identify students who are in the low income are quite poor. And so what are the kinds of solutions we need? So I think one area we really need to push for is to be more thoughtful about these alternative methods of identification. So many people talk about things like social, emotional, and motivational kinds of factors and how those might play into it. Again, that's a place where there's been some work and some momentum. We're often finding, again, not scalable, difficulty getting that to be done on a wide scale. There's a lot of talk about teachers being able to do recommendations. This is certainly something I think empowering teachers to do that is important. But to do that, we're going to need clear teacher training and professional development. So again, being very thoughtful about where these come from. And then finally, a sort of untapped area with respect to identification is we really have not pursued the broader cognitive skill sets as much as we probably could have at this point. So we talk a lot about cognitive skills, meaning sort of academic skills, math and language, but there's a whole host of other cognitive skills. One that's very near and dear to me, spatial skills, working memory skills, some of these things. we actually have some preliminary evidence that maybe that's an inroad to finding these students. But then on top of that, you have to think about issues, so I was thinking about then to serve them, right? And to say that we're going to identify as if it's somehow separate from the to serve, you really have to think about identifying for what, and will the programs really look the same across the board? So if we do something like universal screening and we say, well, we'll use local norms and we'll take the top 5% in a school, well, will the top 5% in a low resource school need the same kinds of things as the top 5% in an already high performing school? So again, making that match and then understanding where in that space we need to be. So I think this issue of how we advocate for the kind of identification we need really is tied very closely then to the kinds of programming that we're going to be able to advocate for. And again, I like the range of programs that Jennifer pointed to, that it's probably not a one-size-fits-all, and that we're really going to need to be thoughtful about not only how we identify, but what we're identifying those students for.
Thank you. Checker.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm a huge fan of the report. We at the Fordham Institute have found ourselves dovetailing on this topic with the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation and are pleased to keep company with them. I'm here in part to flog a book called Failing Our Brightest Kids, the Global Challenge of Educating High-Ability Children, High-Ability Students. My co-author Brandon Wright is here, and we went to look at how other countries do this and to look at some of the international data. And we found not only is the United States doing a bad job of this domestically, but we are doing a whole lot worse than a lot of other countries in the world, both at educating high-ability students and at closing the excellence gap. So if you look at the PISA data, for example, you'll find the United States with maybe 8% of its kids in the high-scoring ranks on PISA. Singapore is at 40% of its kids in the high-scoring ranks on PISA. You think Singapore is weird? So look at Germany, look at Switzerland, look at Canada, look at Finland. Why are they doing twice as well as we are at getting numbers of their kids into the high-scoring ranks on the PISA exams? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I think the fundamental reason is that we have completely neglected this as a matter of policy and philanthropy. The United States has spent 20 years worrying about getting low achievers up to a minimum standard of that we usually call proficiency. And it's been a noble, honorable, and moderately productive thing to do. But along the way, we've completely forgotten about the kids who are already above the proficient line. Schools get no reward for moving them further. Teachers get no reward for moving them further. School systems get no incentive or accountability system for moving them further. We've been worrying about getting kids up to the proficiency bar, we've been trying to raise the floor, we've been completely ignoring the ceiling. And if you look at the consequences of this, we have we have much faster growth at the bottom end of the achievement spectrum than at the top end. This is demonstrable and documentable. We have lots of kids who are high achievers in 3rd grade falling off the turnip truck by 8th grade because nobody spotted that they were high achievers and were capable of doing a lot, and so nobody supported them in any way. So by 8th grade, they're no longer, and at 12th grade, or age 15, which is the PISA year, it looks pretty bad. And the achievement gap, the excellence gap that Jennifer has documented, looks even uglier, if I may say, in international perspective. The OECD, for its pains, has separated the test takers into essentially socioeconomic quartiles. And if you look at the ratio of how many high scorers come from the top SES quartile versus how many high scorers come from the bottom SES quartile, in the United States, the ratio is 8 to 1. About 8 high scorers from the wealthier kids for every 1 from the lowest quartile. No country that we looked into has got this right, but some have got it down to 3 to 1. 3 to 1 is better than 8 to 1. If you're concerned about the equity angle here. And in the end, there are 3 arguments for being concerned here, and one of them is equity. One of them is that high-ability kids, especially high-ability poor kids who don't have navigators in their lives, like high-ability upper-middle-class kids have to get them through the system and get the best it has to offer. High-ability poor kids depend on the system. And keep in mind where high-ability poor kids go to school. Usually schools full of poor kids. Schools full of poor kids have lots of other imperatives. And one of the least of their imperatives is worrying about their high achievers. Because everybody says, they're doing okay, they'll do fine. We've got to worry about all these other kids. And we have to worry about the other issues, discipline, attendance, feeding, health, you name it. And so high-ability poor kids, this is why we have an excellence gap. High-ability poor kids get neglected by the system, which thinks they're not very high priority. So we have this 8-to-1 ratio. This is an equity problem for the country. It is a human capital problem for the country. International competitiveness, if you will. Do we want to continue importing talent or on our homegrown talent? Do we want to get all of it from the upper middle class? What about the poor kids who are smart, who could be part of that human capital that we're currently importing from China? But they're not, because we're neglecting them. And then finally, there's a social mobility issue, an upward mobility issue. Who are the poor kids likeliest to be able to ascend the ladder in America? Smart, poor kids. They are the likeliest to ascend, but only if they are supported, only if they are educated, only if their potential is taken advantage of. So Brandon and I end up with a number of recommendations in the book. Hope you'll read the book, of course, but our recommendations parallel the Jack Kent Cooke recommendations. Some of them aren't that hard to do. Universal screening. Every kid in a public school in America today starts taking reading and math tests in 3rd grade. That's federal law. What if you looked at the highest scoring kids in each school on the tests they're already taking? And then what if you added more kids that the teachers think have potential, who aren't necessarily high scorers, but have that gleam in their eye? And then what if you provided these supplemental programs? New York City does more of this than a lot of places, but not in every part of every borough. And it's not universal. You have to kind of sign up to take the gifted tests in New York. Somebody's got to say, take it. It's not that it is taken. You could go from universal screening to supplemental programming, to summer programming, to intelligently organized ability grouping within the school, to this heresy called individual progress through school based on mastery of what they've learned. This is, in fact, what we should do for every kid. But it will, of course, overturn everything in the structure of American public education if you stop saying every 11-year-old belongs in 5th grade. I have an 11-year-old granddaughter who is in an expensive New York City private school, and she's doing math, or would be doing math, at the 8th or 9th grade level, except that even an expensive New York City private school can't deal with this because they think she belongs in 5th grade and doing 5th grade math. Well, if we could move kids at their own speed, according to what they've learned, we would make a huge improvement in what this country is doing for its kids. So we need a policy change, we need a practice change, we need a standards change. Above all, we need this issue to be on the agenda in ways it has not been in the United States for at least the last quarter century.
Thank you. Reactions?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Chester. I'm a huge fan of Chester's book, too. So it goes both ways.
Thank you.
No, in all seriousness, it is really, we do share a lot of the same perspectives, and I think the call that you're making there for changing the schools is really important, in part because we know part of this disparity, part of the excellence gap comes because a child who is born into a very low-income family with parents perhaps who didn't make it very far in education themselves, perhaps they don't speak English themselves as their first language, they are not getting the same kind of stimulation in the home as a more affluent child who is born to parents who have master's degrees and who's taking them to museums on the weekend. And so that low-income student relies on the school system to level the playing field. And so the points about trying to change the way we are educating, to say we can't have a system that moves students lockstep through, but we need to have a little more of a customized approach is a really important suggestion. And Amy, I think, your point about identification ties in with that, and I would absolutely agree. We are at a space now, and the call I think I would make in response to the points you were making is we don't have a magic identification system figured out. We don't have a perfect system, but we also we're only starting to examine how the systems that we are using are working. So first of all, in places where there is no system, let's start using something and then assess how it's working and see who's being identified and who's not, and add in and figure out a way so that all students have an equal chance.
So let me press on that point. There's a very major debate in this city about how to screen for gifted and talented programs. And one can array it on a range from one test that is essentially an IQ test to a panoply of different kinds of measures that tends to be geared towards a more inclusive socioeconomic and racial group because the data that comes at us from the single test reproduces the structures of the status quo. Those who have get more, and those who haven't don't. Where do you stand on this? If the outcomes are the ones you're all citing, that is AP and International Baccalaureate and advanced levels, if that's the thing we're aiming at as the distinguishing feature later on, what should we be doing at the front end?
Well, universal screening, according to me, does not mean a single citywide norm that everybody has to meet regardless of where they live or where they come from. We know what result that produces, and it's not a socially or politically acceptable result, even if it is a statistically defensible result. That's why I said the top 5% or so in every school, or if you prefer, every neighborhood, or every sub-district of this city's massive public education system. That will produce a much more varied group. We have a very interesting economics paper in the National Bureau of Economic Research by a couple of young economists in the last 6 months that actually studied the effects of universal screening of this kind. Versus waiting for someone to be nominated or waiting for parents to apply. It ends up being much more equitable in terms of the distribution of kids in it. No, it's not perfect. It means that some upper middle class kid who would have made it on the citywide norm isn't going to make it. Okay? Let him go to Johns Hopkins in the summer.
Amy.
So I largely agree, and I think that but I think that there's a deeper issue that we have to address, and as we tend to be talking about this as if we know that by taking the top 5%, that's going to give us the gifted kids. But I think we've learned over the years that that's not, that there's not necessarily one kind. And so when you talk about the multiple measures, I think the rationale for that is, one, that it helps us with things like how heavily curriculum-based a lot of the testing is. So even in our very best standardized aptitude tests, we know that they're affected by the curriculum. They're affected by early childhood experiences. We know there's an influence there. And so I think that when we talk about what are the ways we have to approach this, I think the issue of having multiple tests or multiple measures or multiple contributors, you can think of assessment being much broader than just giving tests, that we have to think again about what is it we want those tests to identify for. Where do we want to put these kids? What are the kinds of programs? So I think you really have to lockstep those two things. You have to say, what is it that children, say low-income children who are not in a low-income school, there's these students that fly under the radar in the better schools. How do we identify those children? What are the things we look for? Certainly in the literature we found things like if you ask teachers to identify a set of students, they will identify those very strong students. But if you ask them to go beyond that, they'll identify often the kids who behave well. Well, a young, gifted child who is under-challenged may not be behaving well in school. And so we have to be very creative in the way we think about this issue. So I think this charge to say, yes, we need to be screening more broadly, and I would actually say, and early. Which again, it poses a challenge for those of us in the testing world who have to say, how do you screen early? How do you find these children early?
One more pressing. Is the object to maximize the percentage of American children who will score high on AP?
Well, that's not the ultimate objective, but it would sure be nice to be at least up there with, let's say, Germany on the PISA.
Because I'm trying to match the strategy with the outcome. I noticed, for example, in your report that dear old New York, while it's dreadful in terms of its inputs, actually does rather decently on its outputs.
You're in the middle,
Oh,
yes.
right. I was trying to be polite, given the audience. But I think the question is, we can be ecumenical in the inputs, but are you ecumenical on the outcomes?
So I think my answer to that would be that I think things like AP, percent of success on AP, percent that are achieving high on PISA, I don't think those are actually what we're most interested in, but those are predictors of the things we are interested in. They're career outcomes. We do know things like students who do well on AP tests have a high rate of getting into better schools at higher ed levels, that their career outcomes tend to be a little bit stronger. We actually need more research in this area to really do those stronger links to the career outcomes. But we do know these are predictors of it. So I think even though it sounds like we're saying we just want, again, we're back to test scores, we want good test scores. These are test scores that are predictive of the things we do care about, which is getting people to their best possible career paths.
Let's be clear that we're never going to do this perfectly. There's always something about any screening system that is unfair to somebody. Let's acknowledge that. The state of Ohio, where we at Fordham do a lot of work, has a 5-part definition of giftedness, and they require that every district in the state identify kids who fit one or more of those 5 definitions. That yields about 15% of the kids in Ohio as meeting one or more of the definitions of giftedness. Now, where Ohio falls down is it doesn't require anybody to do anything for those kids. But we've got an amazing database of kids who get identified as gifted in the early grades. And it's not perfect. I mean, is 5 parts, is 5 definitions enough? Is one of them silly? Maybe. But it doesn't have to be perfect to be better than it is.
Right. One more round from me, and that is, I didn't see any reference, I may have missed it because it's a wonderful and thorough report about curriculum. It strikes me that you're speaking about opportunity to take AP. For those of you who want to check, the AP exam in Latin has set texts. The AP exam in Spanish literature has a whole series of authors with small excerpts. And the AP in American literature has no set text whatsoever.
Of course.
The more important the thing is, the less intellectual meat is actually found in the sandwich. So the question now becomes, are we looking at the right thing when we're worrying about this country's, you cited the data, right? The comparative disaster of what we give to our gifted children. Is it really that we're not identifying enough of them, that we're not giving them access to better kindergarten or whatever? Or is this systemic in the way that we treat children and our curriculum in the United States?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say yes, it's both.
All right.
Yes, I mean, they're 2 somewhat different problems.
Okay.
One of them is a generic problem about American K-12 education and how we think about what's important for children to learn. That is a problem worth solving. A overlapping but separate problem is how are we dealing with high-ability kids, especially high-ability poor kids who lack navigators in their lives, be they parents or teachers or others. I think we need to, again, walk and chew gum. We got to work on both problems. They overlap. Amy?
I would take that further to say that what we really need in terms, so we've talked a lot about identification. The goal of identification in sort of typical terms is that, we're trying to find these kids and then do something with them. But really what identification should be is identification of a student's needs. This is something we should be doing for all children. It just happens to be the case that we're particularly lousy at doing it at the high end. And so this question of how we identify is not just where's this cutoff that says this student now deserves additional services. It's what can I understand about these students and their needs? And I think that is systemic, that we do not have the systems in place to address an individual student's needs, meet them where they are, allow them to move at the pace they need to move at, whether that's slower or faster. And so that's where I would agree with you, that it is not just, it's not a simple answer, that it is a system-wide problem on how we deal with the curriculum, and really the issues of pacing as well.
And let me now bring in race, because again, I felt there was a little bit of silence on that issue. Obviously, the focus on those with disadvantaged income from their family, but as we all know, there's a huge overlap. To what extent is the acting white problem, is the work that Ron Ferguson and others have done on the self-identification of groups, the pressure against academic excellence, first of all, does this research still stand up? Is it worth talking about? And secondly, if to some degree it still does, isn't that part of what we should be talking about?
I don't know whether the research still stands up. I will defer on that. But yes, this is something we need to be talking about. Our book is full of data on racial differences in high achievers, both on the domestic data and on the international data. We've got enough good examples, though, of schools where high-ability minority kids have been able to go to a different school where it's actually cool to be smart. And there are structural and delivery system options for kids that can get them out of the trap of being told that if you are smart, you don't belong here. And I think we need to think creatively about how to get more of those delivery systems in place.
Can you give an example?
Well, I was on a program the other day with Harold Levy with Brother Brian Carty from the De La Salle Academy, located on Times Square in this city, a private Catholic school for poor minority kids that does an amazing job with these quirky, poor minority kids and it's free for the kids, by the way, or it's income-based, so it's free for most of them, of extricating them from their neighborhood school and giving them something special. Now, that's private. Doesn't make it bad. We could, if we were brave, do more of these things in the public sector, too. Amy?
I think it comes down to this issue of catching the problem and coming up with these very creative solutions to it. One real big issue we certainly run into is the fact that students are often staying in a school where this is not promoted. And so solutions are things like, can we craft schools where this is going to be promoted, but also just what other kinds of interventions can we do, especially at the younger ages, before those identity issues really become solidified. So again, I think that
Can you mention a couple?
do I know of,
Well,
do I think
yeah.
there are successful
Well,
ones?
part of it is expectations
Right.
and setting a culture. I mean, when
Yes.
you're talking about, we work a lot with middle school students, and a lot of it is using assumptive language and talking to students that when you go to college, here's what's
Yes.
going to happen, rather than if you go to college.
It's been many years since Hofstadter's famous attack on anti-intellectualism in the United States.
He wasn't attacking anti-intellectualism.
He was describing it.
Okay.
He was attacking its sources. To what extent is the anti-intellectualism, the sort of anti-meritocratic strain that goes very deep in this culture, in this society, part of this story?
I
Sure.
think,
Go ahead, start.
I think the big issue is that we want to believe in educational equity, and we as a culture have to redefine that. That equity has long meant give the same opportunities to the kids, fix the curriculum, put the kids in these curricula, and we've compared schools to each other based on sort of how they do across the board. Whereas I think when we start talking about educational equity, the culture needs to shift to equity means meeting a student's needs, and that the opportunity needs to fit, this matching between what the student needs and where they are. So I don't know that really addresses it, but I think that's where the need is. It's getting a change in our attitude about what it means.
And that some students may end up learning more than others, or
Yeah.
ending up in a different place. It's okay to have different pathways.
I mean, there's no doubt that we pay more attention to celebrity stars and sports stars than we do to intellectual stars. And every once in a while, an American wins a Nobel Prize, and we say, "Wow!" But we're not particularly good at lauding and celebrating and applauding high achievers in this sphere. And but I'm not prepared to say we got to change the culture before we can do anything with the education system. We just can't wait for that. Meanwhile, we're importing talent from Asia to man the think tanks of Silicon Valley. So there is need for high-achieving, highly educated individuals, and our domestic system isn't meeting that need.
It just, there seems to be in various quarters certain kinds of embarrassments about these issues.
Well, it got even worse the other day when Intel pulled the plug on the science prize. I mean, what a squalid thing to do. One of the few things that high school kids in America could aspire to that was intellectually really distinguished was to win what for a long time was the Westinghouse Science Prize.
Yes.
All right. I don't know who's going to take it over now. I hope Microsoft or Google, somebody does.
That seems a good point to turn to the audience. I will recognize questions. Please, as I always say at these points, please make it a question.
Since we have a couple days left in International or National Dyslexia Month, I was wondering if the report or the book looks at the twice exceptional challenges in our country, and just because if an otherwise gifted and talented kid that has dyslexia, and what kind of services and policies the states have for that.
The report is not looking explicitly at that, but we actually see that at the Cook Foundation with our scholarships, and that's one of the areas where we're fortunate enough to be able to work with those students to meet their needs, as Amy is saying, and that we have a lot of twice exceptional students who, with the right supports, are actually doing wonderful things.
Yeah, go ahead.
I say we also, I say the twice exceptional issue I think is a really important one, and in fact at the Center for Talented Youth we actually have a robust program for trying to address that, because I think you're absolutely right. A lot of the students that, if they're not getting identified as gifted, but they're being identified for a learning disability, sometimes they're then off the radar and completely for the advanced learning programs, and so I think that is something that I don't know how many states actually address it. I think that's something that has not been explored carefully. You see it more in states that are treating gifted as special ed, but I think it's a very serious problem. I think the talent searches have done a good job of addressing it, whether or not we're there with the schools. Maybe we need to feed that back to the schools more.
One right at the back. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad the Catholic school issue came up because that was one of my questions. But going forward in research that any of you up there are doing, I would hope that you would include the local Catholic community in your stats, because that's where so many of the more able students end up throughout the country. My question is about the PISA scores. Is it not true that in Germany and for all of Europe and many Asian countries that there's movement of students into a technical stream? They separate the academic and the technically oriented students around 4th grade. We don't do that here, and so you have a completely different pool going into the PISA test at 15.
Well, the PISA test is a good sample of all the 15-year-olds in the country, regardless of what kind of school they do or don't go to. And the OECD people work really hard at this sampling. So even if there is a rigorous tracking system in the education system, the 15-year-olds are across the country are being tested on PISA. So I think it is a legitimate measure of the academic achievement of the 15-year-old population of the country. Now, by the way, I was in Germany in connection with this book, and they're getting a lot more flexible about kids being able to move between tracks, change their minds, a lot of options besides, and a lot of these decisions are now getting made later rather than at 4th grade.
I would just add quickly on the Catholic point, at Johns Hopkins we'll be celebrating next year the 50th anniversary of his first work, but of course the second work was very much focused on the achievement of Catholic schools. And I agree with you. I think it's something that we should look at, not just Catholic schools, but a broader array of educational circumstances and structures to see what's going on.
David is referring to, without naming, James S. Coleman.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, the discussion so far has been, on the one hand, about the students and their need, the bright students, state policies. There's something missing here, a kind of a mediating institution or group. That's the teachers. Who teaches gifted students, and what is the role? What is the role, in particular, of union contracts in preventing us from getting the best teachers to teach the best students? I've written about this, and I have some experience. I was, both of my kids went to Stuyvesant High School, and I went to Stuyvesant High School, and when my kids were there, I wrote an article for Education Next, and it was titled Facade of Excellence, because my argument was that while it was an absolute wonderful meritocracy for the students, it was a mediocrity for teachers. And I don't mean the media, I mean as in mediocre. And the example, so what do we do? I recall having this discussion with Harold, because at Stuyvesant they were about to get rid of the best math teacher in the school because he didn't have enough seniority. He was the coach of the Romanian national math team, and they brought in a seniority transfer from a school which he had never taught higher than 8th grade algebra to Stuyvesant High School. Harold intervened. We saved it. But what do we do?
Let's ask. We have people.
What do we
here.
do about the
Right.
unions and the
We have two
excellence?
different questions here. The first is about how we prepare teachers to be gifted and talented. Do you want to say a word
I
about
can
that?
speak to that briefly. So that was one of the things we looked at, and interestingly, only 2 states in this nation require that new teachers who are being trained have any level of training in their teacher training program related to gifted education. Only 2 states. And so it's important because, as Amy's talking about, you're differentiating instruction. If you haven't been taught yourself how to identify a student who is gifted, then those teacher recommendations are not going to work. And if you don't know how to challenge them, it's not going to work
Tony,
either.
do you want to say a word about your teachers?
I wasn't anticipating speaking. We have a little bit of a luxury, certainly at the high school level, and I think have a focus on a higher level of content for students at the high school. But I know that we've been, really pushing and encouraging training for teachers in gifted ed, and certainly working with the Hunter College Gifted Center to have at least our teachers who are very prepared in terms of content learn more theory about gifted ed and about pedagogy for gifted learners.
Unionized, right?
Huh?
Your teachers are unionized?
Our teachers are unionized, part of the PSC.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. 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 We have. Yes, Mark.
Chair, just quickly, what are the 5 categories that Ohio uses, and do you and the other panelists think they're good ones?
I can't do it from memory. It includes, artistic and musical, and sometimes it gets a little weird, like the creativity. How you identify that is not always clear to me. I can't do it from memory, but you could look it up because you're a very good researcher, Mark.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah,
Mike's coming.
it seems to me that in a lot of our urban districts where most of our poorest students, low-income students live, there's this inherent political tension that the vast majority of schools aren't working for those kids, and it's a resource allocation issue also. Why are we going to allocate resources to that top 5% when the resources for the other 80% of the students is really crappy? And so how do you deal with that political tension, which I imagine is huge in every major urban center?
It is a tension. As I said, it becomes circular when you realize that a lot of the top 5% that aren't getting resources are themselves poor and minority, and are in fact drifting in that same school that you just referred to. And the question is whether the best students in the school should have no resources allocated to their additional education, in order that all resources can be targeted on kids who are not yet able to read, write, and do basic arithmetic. It depends on your definition of equity. Is equity putting all resources into the lowest achievers, or is equity putting all needed resources into kids who need them?
So,
Yeah.
and I think that this gets at this issue of what is it we want to see happen for a child. If we're, I mean, in an ideal world, what we want to see is a child grow over the course of a year, and that should be true regardless of where they are on the spectrum. And I think the point of this is that it's that growth that we should be focused on, and that means there needs to be growth for the students at the top and the students at the bottom and the students in the middle. And I think what we're focused on here is that the way the resources are currently allocated, it tends to be at that lower end. In fact, we have a project funded by the Overdex to look at this issue very closely on where are teachers teaching to and what is it that's driving that. So I think that it is true that there's a question about the equity of it, but if you contextualize it in terms of what are we going for, what is it we want to say? Is it really this basic proficiency, which we know is putting us behind in a lot of places internationally, and it's really not serving the kids that we think we're serving up front anyway. They're still not getting to those stages we hope they get to. They're not getting into the colleges. They're not moving on career-wise. So we're working in a system that has allocated resources. The way that we're suggesting that is you can't put it to that elite at the top. And we're not getting anywhere with that system. If we think about it in terms of this growth, then every child deserves to grow, whether they're at the bottom or the top. And now you have a new way of thinking about the allocation of resources.
Would it help to think of an IEP for
right,
every
so
child?
an IEP for every child, individualized for everyone. I mean, that's that probably should be our gold standard that we should be aiming for.
We do it for special education, but we're not doing it at the other end. I think the point, people often make that argument, and they make it because they say those kids are smart. They're going to be fine on their own. But the reality is they're not fine on their own. And if they come from a low-income family, if they start out, a student who starts out in the top 25% in first grade, academically, they're scoring well in first grade. If they're from a low-income family, only 60-some% of those students are still in that top by 5th grade. So there's this backsliding that occurs, and these students that have potential, who are going to go on to be the thought leaders and the creators and the inventors of the future, are not going to make it.
Go ahead. Behind.
I think the conversation is great. My question is, have you taken a look at the culture within the low-income early childhood? Because that's a major factor. That's the work that I do, and a lot of times the challenge is the families are not involved in the process, nor do they understand the importance of supporting the child and engaging from day one to help get them to be high achievers.
Absolutely. And in Fairfax County, where I live, they actually have a program called the Young Scholars, where they're explicitly targeting low-income and disadvantaged students in first grade. And they're working to identify them early, and they're working with them just supplemental little things here and there, after-school enrichment, all the way through, with the goal that those students will then still be high-performing and will be taking the advanced coursework later.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think, though, you've hit on something that's actually not in the recommendations, and that is that there is a parent piece that we haven't addressed with the low income. And that is not just, it's not just getting parents to want to advocate, but teaching parents how to advocate for their child. And that's something that I think is a real challenge. And I do think there's energy going towards that now. There are people, we're looking at things like, what are the needs of the parents? What is their current attitude towards education? So we've been working with Baltimore City Schools and finding things like, these parents do care about their child's education. They just have no idea how to advocate for it. And
There's a cultural factor enters in too, because we found, and the NAEP data show this vividly, that even low-income Asian immigrant families push hard on their kids and on the schools their kids attend. Including this fascinating population, small, but of low-income Asian families where the parents did not graduate from high school themselves. Nevertheless, they've got more high achievers on NAEP than almost any other demographic in the country. So there's a cultural aspect to this.
One more at the back.
What are the implications for charter schools and voucher programs where they're legal?
I thought we'd gotten through a whole evening.
Thank you, John, for asking the key question.
Right.
Charter schools, in my opinion, should be able to be targeted on high-ability students, not just have open lotteries in all charter schools for all kids. I think one of the niches charter schools could fill. And in Ohio, there is one charter school that does this, and in New Orleans, there is one charter school that does this, and in Wilmington, Delaware, there is one charter school that does this. But under most state charter laws, they have to be open enrollment lottery based, and they can't be in any way selective. Ohio gets around this interestingly by defining gifted kids as a so-called special population under state law. And if you're a special population, a charter school can cater to this population. It can't be selective of individual kids, but it can limit its enrollment to kids in that population.
There's one more question I want to recognize because you've been patient.
I'm actually a teacher.
Hey!
In the Bronx, from the Bronx, teaching in the Bronx. And I was specialized high school and all. And my concern is the skimming off the top and sending our kids out of our communities to go to schools other places. And that the kids, if they stay there, and if they're given, even the talk of resources, for me that's human resources and material. And having them compete, like you said, the Intel and other contests, it's NSTA. I teach math and science, some physics, but now I'm at the middle school level because I ran into so many issues. By the time I got to the high school level, it was too late to help them to get into American Studies or Bronx Science or something like that. And it's just too late. So my idea is, why can't we still have these opportunities, but in our neighborhoods? Especially when you speak culturally. We don't want to send, especially Latinos, and so you can back them around, they don't want to send their kids outside their community. It's too far.
Absolutely.
I think that's absolutely, I think what you're talking about is how do we get the community involved to rally around a school, to build communities that support the schools. I think our best bet is actually not to try to create unique schools. Those are a short-term solution in some ways. That has been effective, right? Creating a school and putting the kids in it. But I think the more we can put our focus on what do we need to do across schools. And that's actually what the report was really about. How do you how do we think about this at a national level with policy, with practice? But I think you're absolutely right. If we can find the right solution that brings the community together and rebuild the school. And I think what we're probably suggesting here is that by attending to the needs of these students, in addition to all students, then we have a chance at lifting the entire school.
I'd like to ask Harold. Yep.
Oddly enough, this conversation is happening in the Bronx with the Bronx Borough President office, a gifted and talent at the same time you're holding this, and I have no clue why.
Because it's an important topic.
It's an important topic.
It would have been nice if they could have, any of us could have not been at the same time, same day.
Yep.
I would love to have been at both.
It's a New York City problem. Harold Levy once was in charge of this district and would love to hear from you some closing remarks.
So first off, let me say, wasn't this a wonderful panel? Thank you. So why the report? Let me talk for a moment about what motivated us. The Jack Kent Cooke Foundation that I now head is able to take in, rough cut, 250 new kids each year. And what we can do with those kids is high touch, customized, individual, and uplifting. We can't do that with the rest of the country, and it is time that we focused on the issue. Checker's book is spot on because it calls the question on the issue of high-performing, and particularly high-performing low-income kids. Why them? Because without help, they flounder. It's a sad reality, but if you look at the data, it is abundantly obvious. High-performing low-income kids, 22% do not take the SAT or the ACT. What the hell is that about? When I was chancellor, I thought if you were high-performing and low-income, as has been suggested, you could write your own ticket. Well, that turns out to be just false, not even close. The kids are undermatched when they go to college. 17% of the low-income kids go to the most selective schools. 47% of the rich kids. What is that about? That's not America. And that's not the American dream. And it certainly is shooting ourselves in the foot economically. It is worse. Not only are they undermatched, but when they get to college, they think they're imposters, the so-called imposter syndrome. They get one bad grade, I'm out of here. I can't do this. I knew all along I shouldn't be here. How crazy is that? They need somebody to rattle them and say, everybody gets a bad grade, go back to work. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. These are terribly difficult problems. But the one thing that's clear is that the high-performing, low-income kid is ignored as we currently have organized our schools. It is a great thing. When I was schools chancellor, I was relentless about the kids who couldn't read and who couldn't get past the Regents exams and would never get a diploma. That's who we have to focus on. But it is not to say that particularly the high achieving kid who's from low income is to be ignored. On what theory? And that is the message of this report. We're not doing our jobs as educators, as politicians, as lawmakers. And as long as we're not, we are failing a population. And it is not just white and wealthy. It is black, it is Hispanic, and we see that at the foundation. The thing I am struck by of our scholars is how extraordinary they each have a story. And the story is of overcoming enormous burdens. And P.S., I'm first in my class. We need to do better. And the message of Checker's book and the message of Jennifer's report is, if we don't do better, we're going to suffer dramatically as a country economically, and we have given up on our core purpose. I'll make two other observations. One, individualized education. You've heard a lot of discussion of that. The one-to-one. Well, the technology gets us part of the way there, and that we need to incorporate in this conversation. But it's not the whole way. And I would also make the observation, in the selection, individualized assessment has a huge downside, and that is it can be politicized. I report to you that when I was chancellor, there was one of the principals of one of the specialized high schools who said to me, you're the first chancellor that hasn't called me to ask to get somebody into the school. I was stunned. I was stunned. And I said, I hope if you ever get such a call, you'll pick up the phone and call the New York Times. I mean, it's incredible. And if you don't have an objective, thing out there, you offset the individualized by the corrupting influence. Not unimportant, particularly in the city of New York. Final point. I want to take issue with the concept of giftedness. Giftedness sounds like a status. It is not a status. We know more than that now. We know about Howard Gardner and the multiple intelligences. We know that it varies over time. Kids are gifted at one point in their development and then somehow drop out and then somehow come back. What's the gifted status? You're in, you're out, you're in. It's developmental. And perhaps most importantly, and this is another lesson I take from my tutor, and from the job I now hold, giftedness, high performance, high achievement invariably requires somebody to draw it out of the child, whether it's a caregiver or a teacher, but somebody has to be involved in that child's life to make the difference. And if there's nobody doing that and inculcating values that matter and that focus the child, well, then it ain't happening, no matter what they came with. It just doesn't work. you know, the classic analogy is to basketball. I'm never going to be a basketball player, right? I'm not tall enough, and my eye-hand coordination is in negative numbers. Same thing for education. There are some people who are never going to be physicists no matter what. But in each of us, there's that opportunity to draw something out. And that's what we have to focus on in dealing with these kids. And I close by saying, and there are people in this room who do it. Centers for Talented Youth, Dan Zarapol in his program. And Phil Weinberg has a lot of these schools in the district that do excellent jobs. And P.S., there are a lot of teachers who do just fine. The issue here is not we can't do it or it's too difficult. I put it to you, the issue is we have no choice. And as educators, that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you all. In this same space on November 10th, we will discuss what I briefly referred to, namely the flight from content in American schools. We hope to be joined by David Coleman, who I hold personally responsible for that flight. But he, of course, perhaps metaphorically, but also truthfully, is off to China the next day. So he's going to try to join us, and many other splendid speakers. So I hope you will be with us on that occasion. But for now, it's my great pleasure to thank our wonderful panel, your report, and thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, Jackie.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.